Hello everyone, and welcome. What about more ancient history tonight? You always ask for more stories about lost cities and civilizations. So for tonight, I have selected 3 ancient cities that were abandoned long ago. And we will talk about them, and of course who built them, as far as we know, and why they were abandoned. If you like these kind of stories, there are many more available on my channel. I'll put links in the description, like Pompeii, Angkor, Maya cities like Tikal, Great Zimbabwe, Petra. But tonight we will go first to South America, to Peru, and the settlement of Machu Picchu, an Inca settlement. Then to Africa, to Sudan, for the city of Meroe, the capital for several centuries of the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia. And finally to Asia, with Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest, if not the oldest large city in the world. But very little is known about the culture that built it. With it, I'll tell you more about the Indus Valley Civilisation. So we're going to travel a lot to these mysterious places, and you can already adopt a comfortable position. Don't hesitate to close your eyes. You will be able to follow everything anyway. You can let go and fall asleep at any time if you feel like it. There are timestamps on your screen and in the description to help you resume later where you left. And in the comment pinned under this video or in the description box, you will find links to audio streaming sites if you'd rather listen there. For example, to save on your phone battery, or if this is more convenient for you. And also a link to my Patreon page if you wish to support this channel and get all the stories as downloads, audio or video. There are more than 100 available there at any time. And now, let's begin our journey. Our first stop is one of the most breathtaking sights in the world, the citadel of Machu Picchu. It is a site you probably have seen pictures of, in the mountains to the south of Peru, near a peak, between the grey of rocks, the green of the jungle, and the blue of the sky. There are the remains of a small city or a large estate where emperors of the Inca Empire sometimes resided. It is 50 miles away from the capital of the Inca Empire, Cusco, a city that still exists. And Machu Picchu is not the largest nor the oldest of Inca ruins, but it is certainly the most famous because of its beauty, because of its relevance as an imperial estate, and also the story of its rediscovery. It was actually never completely lost. The site was abandoned, but people who lived near it knew it existed under the jungle that had covered it. But it didn't attract much interest from archaeologists until the 20th century. But first, to understand what Machu Picchu is about, we need to talk about the rise and fall of the Incas. In pre-Columbian America, the Inca Empire was the largest state in the early 16th century, when the Spaniards started conquering and colonizing the continent. The conquest of the Incas started in 1532, after the Spaniards had well established their domination to the north in Mexico. And 40 years later, the last Inca stronghold fell. This empire extended along the Andes Mountains and along the Pacific coast of South America, on thousands of miles, from what is now Ecuador to the north of Chile, and its heart corresponded to modern Peru. But the Incas were just the last, and probably the most successful at conquering others, of many civilizations or cultures that had appeared in this part of the world, starting several thousand years earlier, several thousand years before our era. The Incas were a people that lived in the highlands of Peru, and sometime in the 13th century, so less than 300 years before Columbus reached America, they started expanding from there. They fixed their capital in Cusco, and they conquered, by war and diplomacy, a lot of other peoples to the north and the south over several generations. They reached their peak at the beginning of the 16th century, just when the Spanish conquest began. Maybe they could have expanded even further and kept progressing if this process had not been interrupted. And because they were cut geographically from Asia, Europe, or Africa, they followed a particular path to civilization. They had discovered or inherited all the basic technical know-how that made them a rather advanced civilization. They used pottery, weaving, metallurgy. They had cities, and elaborate architecture, and urbanism, and administration, and in some fields, like agriculture or medicine, they were quite advanced for the time. On the other hand, they didn't use iron. They still lived in the Bronze Age. They didn't use the wheel to transport things or to farm. They didn't have a writing system. There are no Inca texts from before the Spanish conquest, contrary to the documents produced by pre-Columbian cultures in Central America and in Mexico. They kept records and they communicated remotely using quipus, which were knotted strings. But still, they were very skilled builders. They had built or expanded a large road network that reached all corners of their empire. They produced very refined crafts, and they managed to occupy very different regions, not just mountains and highlands of the Andes. They also ruled over deserts, coastlines, and jungles. And because they annexed regions that were quite far apart, there were many languages practiced around the empire. What unified it was its administration, which was very centralized, and it seems they did not hesitate to move entire groups of people around from one corner of the empire to another, so that they would populate regions that they wanted to see populated, and these people would lose their cultural identity to become only subjects of the emperor. There was also a large army, and the figure of the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered as a divine being and not only head of state but also head of the state religion, this figure was also an element that unified this large state. The emperor, the Sapa Inca, claimed descent from Inti, the sun god, and the patron of the Inca state. A common belief was that Inti, the sun, was born from the creator god Viracocha, and as descendants of Inti, the Inca emperors were directly connected to the creation of the world. And so nothing was too good for the Sapa Inca. This is how the building of Machu Picchu should be looked at. Most archaeologists believe that it was an estate, a residence, built for emperors at the time of Emperor Pachacuti. Pachacuti was an important figure of the Inca dynasty because he expanded the empire and actually transformed the kingdom of Cusco, which he ruled at the beginning of his reign, into the Inca Empire. At the time, just a few decades before the Spaniards arrived, the Incas were very fastly expanding. The population within their frontiers was soaring. The devotion to the emperor was probably extraordinary. And even though Cusco remained the capital, the emperor had this residence, this retreat built for him 50 miles away from Cusco. There is no sign that the site was inhabited before, and so it makes it also very interesting because it was built over just a few decades in pure Inca style, with the monumental architecture, with terraces for cultivation that showcase all the knowledge and know-how of the Incas for mountain agriculture, and their typical polished dry stone walls, that is to say, walls made of cut rocks, rocks of different sizes that are perfectly adjusted. Machu Picchu was used for approximately 80 years because it had to be abandoned due to the Spanish conquest and a civil war that was making the Inca Empire crumble. It is unknown what happened to the residents. They may have fled or died from diseases such as smallpox that the invaders had introduced in America. Conquistadors and then other Europeans arrived in Inca cities, and so they were mapped and sometimes transformed, but not to Machu Picchu. Probably because it was remote and was abandoned without resistance, so there was no trace that Europeans even went there before the 19th century, more than 400 years later. And this is why the site is sometimes called a lost city. It was completely forgotten, including by the descendants of the Incas, not entirely lost, because people who lived in villages nearby, a few miles away from the site, knew it existed, but for the rest of the world, Machu Picchu was completely unknown. So, what was life like at Machu Picchu at the time of its splendor? It seems it was occupied by the emperor seasonally, like a kind of summer palace. When the emperor was present, there would have been about 750 people living there, probably his family, plus guards and hundreds of support staff, probably a few priests too. Because Machu Picchu was rather remote, many things were produced directly there, like food, there were terraces for agriculture, animals like llamas and alpacas for their pelts and meat consumption, a few dogs. The terraces were quite elaborate. In a mountainous environment, it is hard to grow crops. The ground is not flat. So the Incas mastered the building of terraces to grow food and correctly irrigate their crops. In the case of Machu Picchu, there was an abundance of rain. So the problem was not really to bring water to the terraces, but rather to drain it correctly. And for this reason, the terraces were built in several layers. They put large stones at the bottom, then gravel, then sand, and on top of that, rich soil taken from the valley below. This way, excess water fell down and was evacuated progressively because it could trickle down slowly through the different layers instead of stagnating or running down all at once. Exploration of the site suggests that there was not enough cultivation space to feed the hundreds of residents. So part of the food was probably brought from the valleys nearby, but potatoes or corn were grown on the site. These terraces surround the most spectacular part, which is the buildings. There are approximately 200 spread over the terrain with plenty of different levels. Many stairways allowed access to the different levels across the site. A part of the site is called the popular or residential district, the place where the lower class people lived. They had simple houses, and this section contains storage buildings too. And then there was an area for noble houses and a royal palace. Separated from these residences were also several temples or structures of a religious nature. These include a temple of the sun. It is known to be one because similar buildings that were temples of the sun were found in Inca cities, including in Cusco. The temple has a kind of half tower, like a semicircular enclosure that remained open on one side and is typical of classical Inca architecture. The windows were apparently not placed randomly. One of them, which is called the solstice window, was aligned with the rising sun on solstice days. Not anymore, but where the 15th century sun rose. This kind of alignment that reveals the knowledge of astronomy and the seasonal position of celestial bodies can be found in many other parts of Machu Picchu. Another example is the Intihuatana stone that could have been an astronomical clock or a calendar. There are many other similar stones that were found across the Inca Empire. They were arranged to point directly at the sun during the winter solstice, and it is believed that rituals took place near them. One hypothesis is that the Incas believed that these stones were necessary to hold the sun in its place along its annual path in the sky. They would not have been just instruments to measure its position, but also like anchors that kept the world in order. Yet another important place at Machu Picchu is a cave called the Inti Machai. This cave was used to observe the sun on the December solstice, the winter solstice. Every year, the The Incas celebrated a festival in December called the Royal Feast of the Sun. The celebration began early in the month and it ended on the day of the solstice. On this day, boys were initiated into manhood, and it is believed that noble boys had this ceremony organized for them at the Inti Machai. They stood inside the cave and watched the sunrise through a kind of tunnel window that had been aligned in such a way that the sunlight could cross it and illuminate the cave only a few days each year, around the December solstice. How Machu Picchu was built is also not known precisely. It required thousands and thousands of cut stones that were perfectly adjusted to make the walls. The Incas knew various building techniques. They also knew adobe and they had access to a variety of building materials. So why not use mortar? Like in other civilizations, stone was more prestigious and probably seen as more aesthetical. It was also more durable. A lot of Inca monuments have crossed the centuries almost unchanged, at least for their stone parts. And another advantage of dry stone and the tight adjustment of blocks of rock is that it can resist earthquakes. The entire empire was in a seismic region, and that shows in their architecture. Adjusted stones without mortar are good at stabilizing buildings when the earth moves, and also doors and windows were often trapezoidal, narrowing from bottom to top, which gave them more stability. The walls too had various stabilizing features. On the outside, corners were often tied together with L-shaped blocks. And thanks to all these features, many Inca buildings have crossed the centuries in a good state. But in any case, bringing the blocks and cutting them was a huge work. The blocks probably didn't come from very far, but they still had to be carried along a trail all the way up to Machu Picchu. I told you earlier that the Incas didn't use the wheel. Not that they didn't know it. Toys with wheels were found, but they apparently never made chariots or wagons, and this is attributed to the lack of draft animals. They had no horses or cows or equivalent, and possibly also due to the topography. Even though their empire expanded beyond the mountains, their culture came from highlands and a mountainous environment, where the use of wheels made less sense than in plains, for example. So the stones were probably pushed to the side by hundreds of men over several years. For a few years, the region of Cusco, which included Machu Picchu, was disputed between what remained of the Inca state and the Spaniards. The Spaniards were very few, and they had a hard time controlling the entire region. When their invasion began, the empire collapsed very quickly. It was dismantled in only a few years, but it survived as a state for almost 30 years, until 1572. The son of the emperor, who was on the throne just before the arrival of the invaders, Huayna Capac, established a small state in the southeast of Peru, which is called the Neo-Inca state. This emperor Manco Inca Yupanqui, had been placed on the throne before by the Spaniards as a puppet emperor because they needed the Inca administration to control all these lands. But he revolted against them and could make his dynasty survive for a little longer. In the years 1540s to 1560s, the Spaniards reinforced their grip on what is now Ecuador and Peru, and finally the last ruler of this new Inca state, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in 1572, effectively ending the Inca state. Machu Picchu had already been abandoned at the time, but since it was remote and in an area with few inhabitants, it was mostly forgotten and soon hidden under vegetation. It is only more than 300 years later that archaeologists found the site, and they started to realize its importance. They were stunned by its beauty, too, and in the 20th century it turned into an icon of the Inca civilization. For our second visit of the night, let's head to Africa, more precisely the region of Nubia in what is now Sudan, to the ruins of Meroe, the capital of the Kingdom of Kush. For several centuries, the Kingdom of Kush was a powerful state that developed an advanced civilization. It traded with the rest of the world, and it challenged Egypt to the point that it invaded it in the first millennium BC. And for a few generations, Egypt had Nubian pharaohs. Meroe was made the capital of Kush in the 6th century BC, and its ruins give an idea of the wealth and influence of its kings. The site contains more than 200 pyramids, which look at the same time familiar because they remind of Egyptian architecture, but not quite. They are Nubian pyramids. There's a lot to say about that, so let's explore this history. And first, we need to talk about the historic region of Nubia. You know that historically, Egypt was divided into two main regions: Lower Egypt, which is the north, the delta of the Nile, and Upper Egypt. But the Egyptian civilization flourished along the most northern segment of the Nile River. To the south of Upper Egypt, there are still thousands of miles of river flowing through the desert. South of Upper Egypt, there is Nubia, which begins at the first cataract of the Nile. There are several cataracts along the river. There are shallow parts where the surface of the water is broken by many stones and boulders, which makes navigation difficult or sometimes impossible. And Nubia extends all the way to the south, where the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet. These two rivers are the main tributaries of the Nile. This confluence is near Khartoum, the capital of modern Sudan. So civilization developed in Upper and Lower Egypt, in no small part thanks to the geography and the climate. The land was fertile, protected by deserts on each side. But south of Upper Egypt, the conditions were not that different. South of the first cataract, in Nubia, a different culture emerged and also formed states founded cities and built monuments. The earliest known civilization in Nubia is called the Kerma culture or Kerma kingdom, and its earliest known traces appeared in the 3rd millennium BC, around 2500 BC. Kerma flourished until 1500 BC, for about 1,000 years. Its origins were in the south of Nubia, what is central Sudan today, and over time Kerma expanded north all the way to the first cataract, where its frontier met Upper Egypt. Time had passed, Egypt had developed, and during the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, that is to say about 2000 to 1700 BC, it seems there were intense trade and sometimes warfare between Egypt and Nubia. The Egyptians needed various resources from Nubia: incense, ivory, and even more gold, because there were rich gold mines. So the Egyptians established trade relations, and oftentimes they sent military expeditions when they could. During the Egyptian New Kingdom, they conquered a big part of Nubia, and they ruled it directly around 1500 BC. This put an end to the Kingdom of Kerma. But the Egyptians always had a hard time controlling Nubia. It was a large region. They built forts along the Nile, but they could never entirely eradicate rebellions. When the New Kingdom declined, Nubia recovered its autonomy, and in the north of Nubia this time, a new Nubian kingdom emerged, the Kingdom of Kush. The term Kush is how the Egyptians called Nubia, and this new state was established in the 11th century BC. And because it had formed in a region occupied by Egypt, even though Egypt was disintegrating, it had a lot of cultural affinities with Egypt. We will see it with the architecture, but the religion was also strongly influenced. The Nubians from Kush had adopted the cult of Amun, a god that was dominant in Egypt, especially Upper Egypt, during the New Kingdom. But apart from that, the customs, the language, the appearances were different. The Nubians were black Africans, and in Egyptian art they were always distinguished by their dress or the animals that they had domesticated. Their way of life was also different. They depended on the Nile for agriculture, like the Egyptians, but they practiced much more herding. They used more wool rather than flax or cotton. Their art and their crafts were easy to distinguish. Even though they were two separate entities, this Kingdom of Kush kept close ties with Upper Egypt, so much so that, because Egypt was disintegrating, it came to dominate it. Egypt was no longer unified at the beginning of the 1st millennium BC, and in the 8th century BC, a king of Kush called Kashta also became king of Upper Egypt, apparently peacefully. His influence extended to Thebes, the capital of the Egyptian New Kingdom, which was now over. His successor, Piye, invaded the north, Lower Egypt, and the Kushites came to rule over all of Egypt. Piye did what many invaders of Egypt did along history. He proclaimed himself pharaoh and founded a new dynasty. This dynasty, the 25th, is also known as the Nubian dynasty or the Kushite Empire. or the Black Pharaohs, and it lasted for over a century until Egypt was invaded again, this time from the east, when the Assyrians arrived and conquered Lower Egypt and most of Upper Egypt. The rule of the Assyrians didn't last long. There was a rebellion led by Egyptians who retook the country in the 7th century BC, and its leader, the leader of this rebellion, became a new pharaoh, the first of the 26th dynasty, Psamtik I. So the Nubians had been expelled from Egypt, and the Kushite Empire was limited to Kush itself, to Nubia. In their reconquest, the Egyptians, led by Psamtik, entered Nubia, and they sacked their capital, Napata, which was in the north of Nubia. Eventually the Egyptians were repelled, but now that Kush had returned to its old frontiers, and the capital was dangerously close to Egypt, the kings of Kush decided to found a new one, a new capital, much farther south than Napata. And this is how Meroe was founded in the 6th century BC, in the south of Nubia, between the 5th and the 6th cataracts of the Nile. At the time, it seems the site was chosen not just because it was far enough from the frontier with Egypt, it was also on the fringe of the summer rainfall belt, so not as dry as Upper Egypt and the north of Nubia. There were forests near it, and a lot of iron ore, which both were useful for iron working. It was also a good location for trade routes towards the east, to the Red Sea, and towards the west, to other African river systems. The choice of this location was probably a good one, because despite the loss of Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush would prosper for several centuries more, and Meroe would become an impressive city. Archaeologists have divided the history of Meroe into different periods, from the 6th century BC, its foundation, to the 4th century AD. That's almost 1,000 years. For the first 200 years, there was a balance between Napata, the old northern capital, and Meroe, the southern capital. But increasingly, kings and nobles were buried in Meroe, and the political and economic center moved south. The importance of Napata became mainly religious. It was where the main temple of Amun was located. The inhabitants of Kush had a pantheon that mixed Nubian and Egyptian gods. From centuries of contacts and the time when they had ruled over Egypt, the Kushites had retained a strong Egyptian influence, and it is particularly visible in the building of pyramids. But the Nubians started building them long after the Egyptians had stopped, and their pyramids were different. The most impressive pyramids for pharaohs were built during the Old Kingdom in the 3rd millennium BC in Egypt. But then this practice came to an end, and the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, for example, were all buried in underground tombs. What continued in the New Kingdom was the building of small pyramids for elite families that marked the location of their tombs. This is what the Nubians emulated. They had obviously also seen the very large pyramids in the north of Egypt, and they started building some in Nubia in the 8th century BC. Nubian pyramids have a different shape than their Egyptian counterpart. They rise from a fairly small foundation footprint, but they are relatively high, 6 to 30 meters, that is 20 to 100 feet in height, so their structure is narrower. Of all sites where pyramids were built, Meroe has the most, more than 200. And actually the Nubians built more pyramids over a few centuries than the Egyptians ever did. They tend to be smaller. There are no giant pyramids in Nubia, but dozens of kings, of queens, and nobles had them built. After Meroe was founded, Egypt remained unstable. After the Assyrians came the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, and the relations between Kush and its neighbor in the north was sometimes conflictual, especially with the Romans. In the 1st century AD, both sides sent expeditions to loot on the other side until a peace treaty was signed. But apart from these periods of war, Kush and Meroe got their prosperity from the iron industry. Iron was exported together with textiles and the traditional exports of Nubia like ivory and gold. There were finds on Nubian sites of the late antiquity which indicate that goods from India or even from China reached it, probably passing across the Red Sea or via Egypt on the ancient Silk Road. And even though the pyramids are the main remains of the city because they were built with stone, there were also large temples inspired by Egyptian architecture and religion. There were palaces and hundreds of houses. In the late antiquity, the Kingdom of Kush declined around 300 AD. The reasons, or maybe the combination of reasons, is not very well known. There might have been an economic decline due to desertification, political infighting, or wars, because in the 4th century, the city may have been conquered by the Kingdom of Aksum, a kingdom from Ethiopia, which existed from the 2nd to the 10th century. At an unknown date, but probably in the 4th century, the site was abandoned and a lot of pyramids were buried slowly in the sand. Christianity had now reached Nubia, also in the 4th century, and smaller Christian kingdoms replaced Kush. The next wave of invaders to arrive in Egypt were the Arabs, bringing Islam with them, and it finally arrived in Nubia, but very slowly, because these kingdoms existed for several centuries and contained the Muslim expansion south of Egypt. They still traded intensely with Egypt in the Middle Ages, and Islam progressively took roots in Nubia. But at the time, the site of Meroe was already almost erased from memories. It actually was mentioned in Greek texts that called Kush Ethiopia. If you listen to it, I told you recently about the myth of Perseus, and in his tribulations, Perseus went to Ethiopia, where he rescued Andromeda. Even though the name Ethiopia was finally attributed to a country that is to the southeast of Nubia, this land that the Greeks knew of and called Ethiopia was south of Egypt, and it was actually Nubia and the Kingdom of Kush. Now we still have one last stop to do tonight. For our third story, we're going to move farther east to one of the largest early settlements of mankind, which remains on many accounts a mystery, the city of Mohenjo-Daro. It means Mound of the Dead Man in Sindhi, and it is located in the Indus Valley. And again, to better understand where it comes from, we have to talk about the civilization that built it, the Indus Valley Civilization. I often told you about ancient Egypt and about Mesopotamia, where some of the most ancient civilizations with states, cities, writing emerged. But there was a third cradle of civilization in the Near East or in West Asia, the Indus Valley. The Indus River flows from the Himalaya to the Indian Ocean, mainly through Pakistan, and it played a role similar to the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. On its banks, thanks to favorable conditions, an elevation in standards of living because agriculture was productive, cultural exchange within the region, cities appeared and they flourished during the Bronze Age. The Indus civilization expanded to a quite large area. Its remains are in modern Pakistan, the northwest of India, and as north as Afghanistan. The first traces of this civilization are dated from the 4th millennium BC, similar to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and based on the size of cities and archaeological exploration, it reached maturity between 2600 BC and 1900 BC, contemporary to the first Egyptian dynasties and the rise of large cities in Mesopotamia. The cities of the Indus Valley may actually have been larger than their counterparts in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mohenjo-Daro, that we are going to speak about, or Harappa, another urban site that hasn't left such impressive ruins. These cities may have had 30,000 to 60,000 inhabitants, a huge number for the 3rd millennium BC, because it meant they had to be fed, and this implied a lot of villages and space for agriculture around them. In Western historiography of the antiquity and archaeology, the Indus Valley was overshadowed for a long time because it was farther, because a lot of our views were shaped by the Greco-Roman heritage. So there was always a lot of interest in the Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East, all the way to Persia, but less understanding of what had happened further east. The existence of the Indus River was known to the Greeks and the Romans. The Persian Empire had expanded to the Indus region, and Greek travelers had gone there. Then Alexander the Great also reached it, but this was in the 1st millennium BC, long after the decline of these large cities like Mohenjo-Daro. So there was no understanding at the time that something similar to Mesopotamia had happened there until the 19th century. The excavation work that revealed Mohenjo-Daro started only in the 1920s, and even though it progressively showed a large city, much larger than anyone would have thought, a good part of the site is still underground and hasn't been explored. And because we lack ancient sources about it, we don't exactly know whether Mohenjo-Daro was the capital of a large state, a city-state, or something else. We don't know who governed it, We know very little about how its inhabitants lived or what they believed in. It is a giant city, more than 5,000 years old, without much more information about it than the artifacts found locally and its urbanism itself. But these are all very impressive for the time, and they gave us some information about the city. Maybe the most impressive feature is its urbanism. It is obvious that the layout was planned carefully. The city had a grid plan and buildings followed it. So it didn't develop randomly, but instead it was organized from the beginning, or maybe it was rebuilt to make it aesthetical and efficient. The buildings were made of fired bricks of ceramic with mortar, and they probably had wood superstructures. The organization of the city also suggests that it had a quite complex social organization. There was a higher city built on an artificial mound made of bricks that had public baths and a huge residential structure that could have housed up to 5,000 people, together with large assembly halls. For this reason, this part is called the citadel. Maybe it had a military or political significance. And then there was a lower city, where tens of thousands more would have lived, with a central marketplace and a large central well, plus plenty of smaller wells, about 700, so that all households had one near them. Wastewater was channeled to drains that lined the major streets, and in some houses, presumably for more prestigious or wealthier inhabitants, there were spare rooms, possibly for bath and inner courtyards. One building found had an underground furnace, probably to heat water. This kind of luxury and advanced urbanism existed in the antiquity, including in Greek and Roman cities, but 2,000 years later, there is no example in the world of another well-preserved city of the 3rd millennium BC with such advanced features. Mohenjo-Daro had fortifications on some of its sides, like guard towers, but there was no series of walls like in other Indus cities of smaller size. It could indicate that the city was not too threatened by warfare, or that it was well defended by a large army. Even the possibility that it was a capital sounds like a reasonable assumption, but it is not proven. Apart from the structure of the city itself, many artifacts found on the site provide a bit of information about it and the society that lived there. They include figurines made of clay, tools of copper, and seals, balance scales and weights. This gives an indication that there was probably some kind of standardization of scales and measures. Also jewelry, sometimes precious jewelry made of gold and jasper. There were children's toys too. Several furnaces indicate that metalwork was practiced, and more generally there was a lot of crafting activity. There seemed to be an entire section of the city only dedicated to shell working, and Mohenjo-Daro is far from the sea, so these shells would have been imported. The inhabitants had a script, which has been found on seals and copper tablets. It remains undeciphered to this day. An idol of what seems to be a mother goddess was also found on the site. This was a belief common in many Near East cultures, and we know that there were contacts between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia at the time when Mohenjo-Daro was populated. Another remarkable artifact is a sculpture that has been called the Priest King, even though there is no evidence that kings or priests ever ruled the city. But it could have represented a figure of authority. It has a well-trimmed beard and ornamented clothes. For reasons that are also uncertain, Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned around 1900 BC, at a time when the whole Indus Valley Civilization was declining. In the case of this city, it could have been because of floods or because the area could no longer sustain an urban center. And after that, the era of large cities in the Indus Valley ended for a long time, until new civilizations arrived and redeveloped it, probably ignoring that near them lay the ruins of some of the oldest cities in the world. So we have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you liked it. It is now time for you to let go and fall asleep, or pick another story if you don't feel sleepy. I'll let you enjoy the sound of tropical rain for a little while, and I'll be back soon with another story. Good night, sweet dreams. Au revoir.